Hal Stewart, aka Titan, is an extremely acclaimed villain for several different reasons, and I've probably gone over all of them at one point or another by now. But between his subversive nature, and not to mention his extremely realistic portrayal of a creep with entitlement issues, he's certainly not a villain most would expect from a movie like Megamind. But that being said, despite how subversive he is, he's also in many ways what one would call a classical villain. Specifically in that he embodies all of the seven deadly sins. And today, I'd like to go over the seven deadly sins to the best of my ability and prove just how big of a bad guy Hal really was for those who need even further convincing. And as always, there will be spoilers ahead. So if you don't want anything else about Megamind ruined, you really should come back to this video another day. Okay, so despite Titan often being labeled as a twist villain, there's actually a lot of unsubtle foreshadowing surrounding his fall to villainy, to the point that I dedicated an entire video to questioning if he's actually a twist villain, which you can find a link in the description to. And the fact that he manages to embody all of the seven deadly sins is one of the biggest red flags surrounding his character, because anybody with that much vice going on in their lives should not have been given power or trusted to become a superhero. So perhaps the best thing to do now is go over each of the seven deadly sins individually in order to demonstrate how exactly Hal fits each one. Now, first we have lust, which is both very obvious and causes a lot of problems for both him and Roxanne. Because as I brought up in my video on what Hal saw in Roxanne, which you can also find a link in the description to, it's plainly obvious long before he ever becomes a villain that his interest in her is purely a physical one that he feels entitled to have, and makes no effort to get to know her on a more emotional level because he's only interested in her beauty. And because of that, he also makes the classic villain blunder of mistaking lust for love, which only causes him to be both oblivious to how hopeless his crusade to win her heart is, and to come across as more of a creep because he believes he's being charming, when in actuality his attraction to her is plainly obvious in the worst way possible, and is only compounded by his aforementioned refusal to understand her as a person and simply treat her as a typical chick. But then it gets even worse once he becomes Titan, and Roxanne makes it clear that she will never date him, because he then abandons his lust for her and replaces it with a lust for power and vengeance, causing him to go on a citywide rampage. So while Hal's suffering from lust in and of itself wasn't necessarily a problem, the fact that he let it go to his head and dictate his actions several ways over only helped turn him into the monster he would eventually become. And next would be envy, which isn't quite as obvious at first, but clear as day when one looks at his actions a little closer. Because first of all, it's heavily implied that Hal's disdain and disregard for Metro Man is fueled by his believing that he's Roxanne's boyfriend, and since he wants her for himself, is therefore extremely jealous of him. But where this is even more obvious is in how he reacts to Bernard, and immediately sees him as a threat for Roxanne's attention, and goes out of his way to treat him with hostility. And then there's of course his comment that the woman down the hall has way better stuff than him, which he says mainly to save his own skin, but also indicates that he knows that in the first place because he's jealous that she has nicer things than him. But to cap it off, there's perhaps his deadliest display of envy, which only comes out once he becomes Titan, as he makes it clear that he has no interest in serving the city and wants to take it over instead, which is similarly implied to be rooted in a deeply repressed jealousy towards others and the things they have that he doesn't. And now it's time to get his revenge and what's rightfully owed to him. So like I just said, while it might not be obvious at first, Hal Stewart had a clear problem when it came to wanting what others had, and his entitlement complex on top of that didn't do him any favors either. And then we have Gluttony, which isn't dwelled on nearly as much by the narrative, but there are still signs of it. And if you want proof of that, look no further than his big gut, as well as the implication by Roxanne that he talks about unhealthy food all the time, which is only compounded by his apartment being covered in pizza boxes. To put it simply, Hal's love of food and lack of self-control is very obvious to anyone paying enough attention, to the point that only Metro Man's DNA could give such a man an ideal body. But then there's also the fact that once he embraces villainy, he becomes an extreme glutton in a different way, stealing a bunch of stuff he doesn't need just for the heck of it, as well as shamelessly riding the high that his evil actions give him without any desire to come down from it. And in a more comical sense, there's also that he seems to be a pretty big glutton for punishment. Like I said before, it may not be given as much focus, but there's definitely enough evidence to safely conclude that Hal did have a gluttony problem on top of all of his other problems. And now would be sloth, which is quite possibly the deadliest sin he suffers from, because as I explained in more detail in my video on why Hal is his own worst enemy, which you can also find a link in the description to, pretty much all of his problems are caused by his laziness, as well as further fuel his suffering from the other sins, because it's sloth that causes him to act on impulse, have no self-control, nor put in any effort into anything unless he sees something in it for him. And even then he usually only does the bare minimum. As I just said, pretty much everything regarding Hal can be traced back to his laziness. His entitlement, his not getting to know Roxanne as a person, his being a slob that eats too much, and even his desire to be a villain because he thinks it's easier and more fulfilling than being a hero, all come down to the fact that he has no motivation to actually put effort into anything. Frankly, Hal Stewart might just be one of the best examples of somebody driven to villainy by laziness ever, because everything he does is the realistic result of refusing to do anything that's hard. Next would be pride, which mainly manifests itself in the form of his extreme entitlement, because while that is also partially motivated by his laziness, as I just got through saying, it's clear that another part of him is simply thinking, hey, I'm Hal Stewart, so I'm automatically special and am owed everything I want. And, along with his envy, is made particularly obvious when he decides to take over the city, because he believes that he's superior to everybody else now that he has powers and can do anything he wants without consequence. But for easily the best example of his misplaced pride, there's how he reacts when he realizes Megamind tricked him, which is to get really angry and spend the rest of the movie trying to kill him for daring to, quote, make a fool out of him, even though, as Megamind points out, he definitely did not need Megamind to be made a fool of. Really, for somebody as pathetic as Hal, he's certainly shown to have a high opinion of himself, as shown by how vindictive he is as Titan, which only further shows the consequences of not having humility, as it leads to an overinflated ego that will do anything to preserve and protect its self-image. And in a case like Hal, he honestly doesn't have much to be proud about beyond being a good cameraman, which only makes his flattering self-image even more delusional and dangerous. And then there's greed, which, unlike most villains, is actually the vice he seems to suffer from the least, because while he may envy what others have and is overall a glutton, he's ultimately too lazy to really go out and get what he wants, but he still definitely shows shades of it, most notably when he steals a bunch of valuable things just for the sake of it. And there's also that his entitlement may be partially fueled by his unchecked avarice. But once again, and somewhat surprisingly, especially for a kids movie, greed is definitely at the bottom of this list, because even once he goes full supervillain, he mostly sticks to attacking the city to satisfy his impulses and doesn't really act all that greedy, but he still gives enough hints to indicate that he still suffers from it, just not to the same extent as the others. And finally, there's wrath, which is probably the one that he's most well known for, because apart from his laziness, his anger is definitely his biggest problem, and this is obvious even before he becomes Titan, as his reaction to rejection is to get angry, punch his van, and then blame it when he gets hurt. perfectly showing how he can't control his temper. But once his powers remove his inhibitions and Megamind wounds his pride, his anger comes out in full force, and it is way worse than anyone could have imagined. From there, pretty much everything he does is motivated by anger, with the other sins only being secondary and contributing to it. And the results are a destroyed city with what's implied to be countless innocent people dead, all because an entitled moron threw a huge temper tantrum. Because as I've pointed out in many other videos, that's exactly what Hal's rampage ultimately amounts to. Just a pathetic man-child throwing a big fit now that he could get away with it and make others suffer for holding him back. That's even why some consider Hal the poster child for a wrathful villain, because he perfectly demonstrates what happens when somebody has a horrible temper and no morals to stop them from acting on their worst impulses. Though his laziness does also contribute to his anger issues, as it keeps him from trying to fix them or improve himself. Now, while all of this definitely proves that Hal suffered from all 7 of the deadly sins to some degree, the question then becomes which one did he suffer from the most? And honestly, I would have to say that before he became Titan, it was Sloth, and after he became Titan, it was Wrath. Though even then, I would have to say that his laziness just edges out overall, both because, as I just noted, his lazy demeanor keeps him from putting in the effort to get his anger under control and just try to be a better person in general, and because it's what starts to push him towards villainy in the first place, and Megamind unleashing his wrath is only what finishes it. But no matter which one you may personally think he suffered from the most, there's still no question that Sloth and Wrath are his 2 worst vices, and the other 5 only made things even worse and further motivated him to do evil once he got powers. Now, considering just how much he suffers from all 7 of the deadly sins with little effort on his part to improve himself, Hal most definitely proves to be a classical villain, because suffering from all those vices is one of the primary requirements for such a bad guy. He honestly has no redeeming qualities once he becomes a villain, and even as an average Joe, the best thing one could say about him is that he at least had the inhibitions not to do terrible things, and that certainly isn't a compliment. Though to be completely fair, his lack of good traits and indulgence in the 7 deadly sins is pretty much the only place where he's a classical villain, as his character template and role he plays in the story are still most definitely subversive and at least somewhat unexpected, and still holds up very well considering how most superhero movies afterwards would play such characters that he subverts completely straight. But when one looks at Hal's character, it was plainly obvious right from the start that he was a terrible choice to turn into a superhero, and the fact that he proves to suffer from all 7 deadly sins is only the biggest indicator of that, but far from the only one. Alright, I think that's everything I wanted to cover, so now I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Do you believe that Hal Stewart is actually a pretty good example of a classical villain despite his subversive nature? Or do you believe he doesn't actually suffer from all the 7 deadly sins and that I was only making assumptions about his character in a few cases rather than sticking to the facts? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below, because as I note all the time, it's okay if you don't agree with something I had to say here. You can feel about Titan and exactly what kind of villain he is, as well as anything else about his character that you want to, and if you think I couldn't have been any more wrong, that is totally fine. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate all of it, and I hope to see you all next time.